Hello, this is Hugh Grant from Tree Makers Design. I'm coming to you from Australia, and we're here on the Bonsai Time podcast. Enjoy and listen.
Hugh, how's it going, man? How have you been?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
How's getting back to reality?
Oh, back to Australia. Yeah, it's been busy ever since I got home, basically, because we're kind of in peak season right now, start of summer. so so going to the States for those 2 weeks was fantastic, but it kind of squashed up my busiest month of the year, which is usually December. Not because of Christmas or anything, but just because, as you guys know, like beginning of summer is kind of like, watering ramps up, fertilizing ramps up, pruning ramps up. And then of course all my clients also have all of those things going on too. So it's plus as well at this time of year, I do a lot of I also do a bit of landscape work in terms of like using bonsai skill sets for like Nawaki pruning, wisteria pruning, and all of that happens to happen in December also. So so December's always a full-time month. So but it's fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah, so it's funny for us because in our northern hemisphere we're in the dead of winter almost. And today it was really cold, and I was like, oh yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, it was the summer solstice in a week and a half. Yeah, it's raging here. It's all happening.
It feels so alien, Hugh, because I'm seeing you with all the sun behind you, and I'm in a winter jacket inside of my own house. So
yeah, that's it.
We're surviving here. It's fine.
Yeah. It's definitely summer here. It's really hit, which is great because we haven't really had a proper summer in like 2 years, I reckon. Like the whole La Nina effect that's been happening, which also affects the west coast of the States. We've had like a 3-year long La Nina, so we've had literally the wettest, coolest, cloudiest, non-warm 2 or 3 years in recorded history. Since, recorded history 18 something is when those records were started. But yeah, it's been absolute insanity. So we like last summer, we didn't really have much of a summer. It wasn't really that warm. The sun didn't come out that much. Nothing really grew, which was very, very unusual. Never experienced anything like that. So very thankful that this summer is showing its face again. It's good.
That's good.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been so thankful to have to water the garden.
Less disease.
It's all well and good. Yeah, it's all well and good to not have to, but then when it's like months and months and months and months, that becomes a problem in the other opposite direction. So yeah.
We've made up a couple questions here, but we just kind of want to wrap with you today, kind of figure out who you are. And I was gonna say, I know we officially met in person at the Bonsai Expo in California, which was an amazing show, amazing feat of awesomeness. And I graciously appreciate you being willing to be a part of our podcast. We're trying to get a bigger reach just for the community. I told Ryan, he's like, awesome, Australia, that's a new one. I was like, yeah.
Expanding.
I'm going to admit something. I'm going to be totally ignorant of Australia in this interview. So I hope that we can learn a lot about your country.
Yeah, that's kind of even better because it means we can get all the base level questions and the deep questions done. Which I think everyone will appreciate.
100%.
Yeah, it's a quiet little place down here. I had a lot of chats with people when I was at the expo and just the general 2 weeks that I was in the States. It was a good old social time. I had so many conversations with people. But the thing that I really realized was how little people in America do know of Australia. And I think it just comes down to the fact that there's not many of us here. Like there's 20, I think it's 26 million people in a country that is pretty much the same size minus Alaska as the USA.
Oh, wow.
So the amount of touch points that you guys, so many of you, would have with so little of us, the odds are in our favor to know more about you guys than you guys know about us, for sure.
That makes sense.
So kind of key. It made sense to me. I was like, this is why. There's just not that many of us. So the odds to hear anything about us and the bonsai scene and all that sort of thing, it's much smaller for sure, and spread out as well. So we don't hear as much about each other as we would like to hear as well, because we're all spread across this massive country. All the major cities are 10 hours away from each other, not an hour or two, you know.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, it's a different kind of way of living, I think, than what you guys would experience for sure.
Hmm.
I guess on comparison of that too, you know, being East Coast to West Coast in the US, I'm originally from Oregon, you know, where Mirai is located and whatnot. And then
Oh, there you go.
Ryan lived in Seattle and studied with Dan Robinson. You
Hmm.
know, Portland to Seattle's 3 hours, if not 4, maybe more because of traffic. But you drive out East Coast, you can hit 4 states in a day. You know, it's it's that weird dynamic of like, oh, I just went through like 4 states in 8 hours. That's cool.
You're transcending spaces very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's a trip. I guess for starters, is how did you find bonsai? How did you get involved?
I found bonsai when I was very, very young. I was about 10, sort of turning 11. It was kind of on that cusp. And I saw it on television. So we have this show in Australia, which has been going on for ages and still runs. It's called Gardening Australia. And it's just like a good old peppy gardening segment kind of show where they get different people on, there's different hosts, and you know, it's quite a good show. And it was always on at around 6 p.m. at night, and we'd always be having dinner, and Mum would have it on. And there's one segment that came on which was about this bonsai artist somewhere in northern New South Wales, and he had a whole bunch of ficus, lily pillies, which is an Australian native broadleaf tree, and just a whole bunch of other stuff. And I remember being just like completely enamored by it. It was really, really interesting. He had this ficus growing over a rock, and I just thought, holy shit, that's that's the coolest thing ever. And I remember distinctly him like taking branches as like a little demonstration about what the aesthetics of bonsai are. But he took some branches and some trees and just broke them clean off the tree. And then he was talking about how, you know, the creation of dead wood and the creation of life and death is important towards the aesthetic. And I was like, wow. I remember being, as like a little kid, just really captivated by that. And immediately I asked my mum if we could find a bonsai, you know, whatever that meant. And she was like, oh, well, there's this horticulture festival called the Flora Festival that happens on where I grew up. And she goes, oh, it's in a few weeks. And I remember there was a guy who used to sell bonsais there, so maybe we'll get one. So we went, we found the guy, bought a little tree, it's a little tiny Japanese maple in a little tiny ceramic pot, and killed it very quickly, as the story goes. I think that's 99% of bonsai people's stories. They killed it. My thing was I didn't water it, right? Lesson number 1, probably the most important lesson. And just to put it into just to make the death even worse, I remember it sitting there shriveled up dead in the pots there, and I had a little baby brother at the time, and he got into the area where the tree was sitting, and he had like picked it up and chucked it into the pool. Pot smashed in the bottom of the pool.
Oh man.
So not only did the tree die, but I ended up with no pot either. So it was a dramatic beginning for sure to the art form.
Now I got you.
But after that, after that, my grandmother bought me a jade, which is still alive to this day. My mum now owns it. She took over ownership of it a few years ago. But I had that tree forever, and it's thrived and lived. So basically after that, I started taking really, really serendipitously some classes started literally just up the road from me. Most random thing ever, some bonsai class. I realize now how rare that was to happen, but a landscape nursery just started doing bonsai classes, and so I just started attending those. It's kind of like 12-year-old, and from there I just kept practicing. I spent most of my teenagehood running around the local, because I lived in kind of like a rural area, so I spent most of my time wandering around paddocks, digging up a tree called a privet, called Gustrum, you might be familiar with. Yes, hardiest plants on the planet. So I spent most of my teenagehood bonsaiing with those and collecting them, and cow-chewed ones, and it was a good time. So lots of self-experimentation. But I think the reason I was drawn to it originally always was because I used to have like quite it's only something I've realized recently in the last few years, but like I had quite an empathy for trees as a kid, which was interesting to kind of like circle back to. And where I kind of understand that from is I remember because we grew up on this like quarter, I think it was about 3/4 acre block, and my parents made it all into like formal gardens, and it was quite lovely. And I remember my dad, he always wanted me to come out and help him like prune the trees. And he was always really, I felt like very obsessed with making the trees really perfect and really straight and really just like formal, you know. And he would always cut off these beautiful big, you know, descending branches that almost touch the ground, and you'd take them off because they hit the lawn and they got in the way. But I used to like really appreciate the way they whimsically kind of stretched out, because they were very mature trees. And I would just get so upset every time he'd cut a branch off the tree, which is ironic because like bonsai involves a lot of pruning, right? And making big decisions, but it's the aesthetic consideration that I had empathy for. And that's, I think, where I connected with bonsai, was the empathy for aesthetic. And hence later down the track, I then gained a love for trees and nature, because at that time as a kid, I did not. It was just that empathetic response that I was connected to.
That's interesting. Huh. So then now in your appreciation for small trees and big trees with Milwaukee and everything, how do you consider your approach then? How do you find that space to make those decisions?
Like in terms of interacting with the tree, like how do I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think from that childhood response of being empathetic, not actually connecting to the tree, to now bonsai being a tool to do so, I think now I very much align with more like I use bonsai to directly translate how I understand the world. Like I don't know. I don't really care for the idea of making like the best bonsai, quote unquote, the best bonsai or the most valuable bonsai or something that is, I don't know, beautiful in a general sense. I like to make work that translates my experience and how I've seen the world or experienced the world, you know, whether that's through people, trees, landscape, emotions, whatever it is. And that's how I like to use bonsai now. With of course the notion that you must respect the living being that is the tree itself. So you can't just impose your will. You have to work entirely with it. So I consider my approach to bonsai now very, I guess, like still very empathetic towards the tree and allowing it to express itself while using creativity, selection, and placing myself in context to then translate something, like create a message. And it doesn't say I don't make bonsai just for the sake of bonsai. I do that too, but ultimately for me, that's what's important to me about the practice, is translating experience and allowing the tree to become a vehicle to describe that. And generally that's usually conveying landscape or a sense of landscape for sure.
Nice.
I hope that answers your question.
No, definitely. Yeah. No, that's well put. With your creative space, I've seen your work that you've had trees shown, I believe, in an art show. Was it a fashion show?
Yeah, I've done a few things. Yeah.
Something like that. How do you find that to be outside of the landscape aesthetic? How do you find that to be as an approach? I've thought about those, but Ryan and I both had talked about certain ideas for showings at a show, like our local club show or something. But how does that encapsulate you?
Yeah, that's a super good question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I did just actually today I'm going to go pack down the show that we had in a space called Fineworks, which is in Paddington in Sydney. And it's like a lifestyle gallery that has started to kind of like represent my work. Another artist named David Segal and another artist named Billy Ho, and we're all bonsai practitioners. And they're basically like representing our work alongside furniture, ceramic artists, other just general artists that they showcase in their lifestyle space, which they promote to their clients, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really groovy little space. But we had an exhibition, and it was called Bonsai Interiors, which was really, really fascinating, because the way he curated the trees into the space is he basically just took the trees and embedded them as if they were like sculptures or a bouquet of flowers, so they're sitting on like sideboards or on coffee tables or integrated into a clothing rack of suits, so it was really, really fascinating because it really placed bonsai not in a functional context whatsoever, but in a context in which had a synergy towards the tokonoma, in a sense, the Japanese display tradition of bringing bonsai into the home and allowing that to connect you to the outside world. And this to me felt like a very Western / even Australian version to do so, because the interiors in which are in that gallery space are very much catered towards, it's kind of like a ritzy kind of boho Sydney aesthetic, so it's very, very, very captivating towards the local people, literally, of that city. So having the show called Bonsai Interiors and placing them in that space, it really created this massive contrast, but provided the same vehicle that, say, like the Tokonoma does in Japan, which was a really, really interesting synergy to kind of talk about with the guys. But I think I really like contrast. That's something I'm really interested in, is when you can use bonsai to, because it's an abstract art form in which is trying to dilute something, a tree, into a small form. When you take that and you put it in a space that's entirely opposite to where that tree might actually exist, it almost becomes more powerful in a way, because it allows you to really drink in what's in front of you entirely. There is also a risk that it removes you from that tree being a part of the environment. But if the work, I think, communicates enough rawness, enough lack of the term quality in terms of what it's trying to intentionally say as a tree, then I think that contrast is crazy powerful. So the other show that you were talking about was a fashion show that for Australian Fashion Week, which is a really big fashion show that happens every year in Sydney. And we got hired. So I have a colleague named Shinya Ueda. He's a Japanese gardener in Adelaide, which is down the south of the country. He's the guy who's kind of helped me out get all this landscape Nawaki work, which is really, really fun. But he gave me a call one day and he was like, so we've been commissioned to do this fashion show and we've got to do it by Friday. And this was like Sunday, right? And I was like, oh, tell me more. This is really interesting. And he goes, yeah. So if we're going to do this, we have to lock it in now. I've got to fly up in like a day or two. We've got to go drive around finding materials, construct this thing, have the show, and then pack it down. And I was like, all right, let's do it. So we got together and because we collaborate a lot, and we got together and he designed out this space, and then I worked out how the trees were going to be involved in that space, because we basically needed to construct a dry stone Japanese garden with bonsai displayed in pedestals with a runway down the middle. So we got, I don't know how many tons of gravel, many tons of gravel. We sourced all these stones. We then got all these pavers, and then we spent basically 12 hours setting up this show. So we built a garden in this indoor space. Had the show. It was super, super epic. Really, really interesting to see bonsai and Japanese gardens embedded in an indoor setting that would otherwise be outdoor to display high fashion. It was super fascinating. But the crux was the show was like 45 minutes. And then we had to pack it all down. So, days of effort, and then a whole day to set it all up. And then, a small little show. And then we basically had to spend all night packing it all down, which was, it was all heavy stuff. It was all rocks and trees. And it was intense. But the artist was Christopher Esbar, which is, he's a really interesting fashion designer. But it was fantastic to put bonsai and just that aesthetic into that kind of space and see how it interacted. And I think it was very engaging. So a really, really great opportunity. I really enjoy opportunities like that. I think there's
photos of that on your Instagram, right?
Yeah, it's on my Instagram. Yeah, it was from 2021, I think. Yeah, 2021. Mm-hmm.
I made a note to track those photos down, but if I could follow up, so in both of those very human-made environments, did you find that certain aesthetics of trees worked better? Like of course, in a Japanese garden, they have like a certain aesthetic for a Milwaukee black pine, and it's got like almost like clouds of foliage, depending on who's designing it or like what they're going for.
Yeah.
And then
More
there's like the
passive and
very
full, for
natural
sure.
bonsai form, or like naturalistic bonsai form, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum. So, and of course, there's ranges of pottery. Some are very like smooth and almost like man-made, and then others are more like rough and naturalistic. So I'm wondering if you found that any certain style was better for this environment.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, I think it's hard to decide on what is better. It's almost like I think in those kind of spaces you need to commit to one or another. So a good example is, yeah, I say at the fashion show, we had two bonsai displayed in that space. So we had one tree which upon first glance looks quite quote unquote traditional, very full canopy, very wide, more positive space than negative space in terms of what the tree offered. But it was a Port Jackson ficus, which is a native to, particularly to the Sydney region. And it's a very stout kind of tree with aerial roots, quite beautiful. And that tree, although looking quite, easy to consume because of its full nature, it was planted on a stone. So it had this like directly then embedded back into nature kind of aesthetic. So we had that tree sitting on the ground at eye level, embedded in the gravel amongst some other bigger stones. So it kind of had this weird effect of being, you could see what the big tree was, what it was representing, but it was shrunk down amongst some boulders and was planted on a stone itself. So that kind of hit both ends of the spectrum. And then the other tree was a Banksia, which was a very, very, very whimsical line-based design, very dancey, very kind of, you might consider it abstract, although it does have a lot of elements that when you know that species, you understand that it was quite true to form, but to the non-assuming, which is many of that species, it had a very abstract kind of dancey, fluid, almost humanistic kind of feel to it. And we had that on a very square, tall pedestal. So you kind of had this weird contrast between like something that appeared quite traditional and sort of placid and quiet, although embedded in a natural setting. And then you had something that was quite natural in its true to form creation, but looked quite abstract and was risen up so that it kind of like took the limelight. And I think that is kind of in those spaces what works really, really well, like contrast, extreme contrast, hit one end of the spectrum or another. I think a tree that just sort of sung, quiet, placid, passive, fullness, gentleness, quietness, which, is a big part of the aesthetic, I think, of Japanese culture. Bonsai is trying to portray all those things, it may not grab the attention as much in those kind of spaces. And I think even in the interior space of the lifestyle gallery at Fineworks, kind of having trees that were either really, really edgy or uber duper super quiet was kind of the key. Anything in the middle kind of gets lost in that. I think in the middle kind of gets lost amongst the other things in the room, where the two contrasts of either end of the spectrum, they shine and they kind of cry out to the audience, for sure.
It's an interesting
contrast.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about, but you're probably one of the few people that have displayed high-level trees in such a unique place. So if we ever have the chance to display something like that, Kevin, we'll have to think about all these things.
Yeah,
it's very fun, and I think it also comes down to just trying things. Just try it well, do it well, but just try it. Through visual experimentation is where you then understand what you can do better. Over time. That's always my advice to people: just try shit.
Yeah.
Don't take things too seriously as well. Have a go.
Once you got a garden full of great trees, might as well, right?
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah, bonsai is meant to be enjoyable, and I think we can get bogged down in it's got to be just right all the time. But what is just right? I think just try stuff like through experimentation. So long as the work is like still sounding good, but through experimentation of context, especially, like see what happens. See how it feels, see what it communicates. Because the context utterly transforms what that tree is actually communicating. It's really, really fun. I encourage anyone to have a go.
Where do you feel is I guess it could be ambiguous, but where do you feel that line, if there is a line in this scenario of oh, it's about the tree, it's not about the tree? Where's the middle ground for that in these displays or anything that you choose to do that's offset of the traditional or quasi-traditional model? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think if you're using bonsai as a tool in a context, the tree always has to be number one. It has to still be a functional being, right? I don't think there's any point in bridging that line where the tree is now non-functional in that space. Now, of course, putting a tree on a pedestal in an indoor building is borderline non-functional because it's not permanent. But the understanding of the exhibition itself is that it is impermanent. So I think that is null and void and gets cancelled out. But yeah, I think when you start to use, and artists have done this, where they use bonsai as a mechanism to say another thing, right? Such as, like, you've seen artists, can't remember the names of them, but where they've, bare rooted trees and hung them up, almost like a carcass or whatever, right? And which always cause a lot of contention, I think, amongst the bonsai community, because they're like, well, what about the life of the tree? But in that circumstance, it's not about putting the bonsai on a pedestal. It's using what does bonsai as an art form say, and what does it communicate in its own right. Now let's use that as a small tool in my greater artwork or my greater composition. So it's not about the bonsai at all. It's just that condensed art form having a communicate. It's a metaphor, much like, I don't know, taking a what we're going to think of. First thing that's coming to mind is like a clown's hat. You use that in a piece of sculpture or something, that all of a sudden that metaphor of what that clown's hat is a terrible example, but but it obviously says something. It allows you to connect with something, and the artist is saying something, but that's not what the artwork is. So when you see those kind of works, the bonsai is not what the artwork is. It's just an element inside of the greater context, and its material physicality in terms of functioning and living and prospering and continuing isn't a part of that work. So I think for me, I'm always functioning on a level of, okay, here's the bonsai, here's the trees. Now, how can we use context to allow them to say more things than they do as just a lineup of trees in a garden, right? The holding room, which is entirely valid. Trees have to be created, they need to function, they need to be maintained over time. But when you start to say, oh, now I want to use this as a tool to say something, the context is where it all happens, for me.
Right.
Yeah.
With your time to now of having these experiences of and influences of traveling to the States or traveling to other countries, I'm assuming, and then showing in these venues and avenues you've gone down with trees, what influences prior in your life have led you to this ability to adapt yourself? School, you went to college, right? You went to design school?
Yeah, I studied a Bachelor of Fine Arts at university, and I think for sure that definitely sent me down a direction that I think, I hate to say the word different, but kind of different to, I think, a lot of the way people engage with bonsai initially. I think most people come in to bonsai from some sort of horticultural perspective, like, oh, I grow plants, or I grow orchids, or I grow vegetables, and I'm really interested in this sculptural form that bonsai is, or I love nature and I want to understand that further, and bonsai becomes, I think a lot of people come at it from there per se, or they're inspired by it. Karate Kid is a classic one, but yeah, my journey in terms of, I've always I think seen it, going back to that empathetic response. I think I've always seen it as a way to connect with, it has been the tool that has allowed me to connect with the landscape and understanding ecology greater, and relationships and environment. And most importantly for me, it's all about the aesthetic response that a tree generates in the world, in the environment. That's what really, really interests me, and then allows me to become interested in the connections of human to tree to other parts of the landscape, etc. But the aesthetics are really important to me. And yeah, so I went to fine art school immediately after high school. and I majored in sculpture, primarily using metal, interestingly, and minored in traditional 35mm photography. So seems like two very like different worlds, and they were in a way very abstract. One was very physical, like I was in the blacksmith's room hammering out metal things for hours on end under a furnace, which was fun. And then I would go in and I would go out into the world and take photos on this little camera and then process them in a dark room. And it was all very clean and sterile and minimal interaction with the physical material. So very, very different processes. But in a sense, I see them both as three-dimensional interactions. So the metal work or just the sculpting work in general is very much about understanding three-dimensional space and how objects interact with the space around them. In university, it was called 3D studies. It wasn't called sculptural studies. It was called 3D studies. So it was just about visually understanding the 3D and how can you communicate with 3D objects, which is very broad because technically a piece of paper is a 3D object too. It's an object in space. So sculpture, the sculpture department kind of coined themselves as the everything kind of department, like painting was painting, but sculpture was like, painting can be sculpture too. Sculpture is everything. so we had a bit of a high horse in that department, but the photography I consider very much like a sculptural practice too, because you're going out into the environment, you're taking a physical tool, you're capturing light, then you take that light, which is an abstraction of the physical thing that you've seen, and then you translate that onto an object such as paper. And it really, really takes in the documentation of the space into a very like condensed realm. And so I don't see too much of a difference between like a piece of sculpture and a piece of photography in a sense, because they're both trying to reflect space and three-dimensionality just in totally different ways. So that was kind of like I was a bit of a nerd at uni. I spent most of my time there because it was fun. I really enjoyed it, and I spent most of my time in the studios making work, and I did a bit of ceramics as well, which I used as an opportunity to create lots of bonsai pots, which was fun. Really rode that train.
Advantageous.
Yeah, very, very advantageous. And so I think my lens of bonsai has always come from the inquiry into the visual first, and then the more connection to nature second. Not putting them either in a hierarchy of 1 and 2. I have to consider them equal, but that's how I've kind of like transcended through why I do bonsai. It's the visuals and the communication and what it can do first, and then understanding that, this allows us to understand the environment and the tree and horticulture and all that so much greater, and that becomes why it's such a great communication tool. But like whenever I look at the world, and this is what art school taught you, is ultimately the number one thing that art school teaches you is a visual language. So a way in which to look at something and think, what could this also communicate? Or what is it trying to say? Anything, And that's really what art school, because people always ask me, like, what do you do with that? So like studying to be a doctor, and they're like, oh yeah, I understand what you're going to do with that. But art school, people are like, so what do you do with that? I'm like, well, I now have this broad skill set to be able to, in a way, metaphorize anything. So, everything could be a metaphor for something. And I think that for me is a really valuable part of my life nowadays, because I can move in and out of it, but I love to be able to like look at anything in the world, or even a conversation or a film, or just going a hike through the mountains, or driving down the road and seeing the color of a car, like just anything. You can take that and you can turn that into a metaphor to communicate something else. And that's really what art school is very valuable to teach me, at least. And that's where I come at from bonsai, for sure.
That blew my mind.
Hey,
That's awesome.
I can tell you were an art student because you're clearly a deep thinker on all of these subjects. But
yeah, I can rattle on for ages.
Yeah. So I want to test your metaphorizing skill.
I don't even know if
So
that's a word, by the way.
we're
It
making it a
is.
word
It is,
today
it is now.
for this
Making
It
it a
is
interview.
word.
now. We'll put it in for the dictionary
Yeah,
of Webster's.
yeah.
Yeah, but you and
Metaphorizing.
Kevin both were at the Pacific Bonsai Expo, right?
Yes.
And then you would have seen the tree and stand and glass bubble that were from the Pacific
Yeah.
Bonsai, or no,
Uh-huh.
what the
Pacific Bonsai Museum.
PBM,
Yes,
Pacific
yes.
Bonsai Museum. Okay,
Yep,
I almost said
yep.
Expo again. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could metaphorize for us what you think that display could be communicating. Because
Yeah.
on the surface, it kind of looks like, oh yeah, this is a cool combination. Like we don't usually see glass with concrete with bonsai. But
Mhm.
I've been trying to figure out were they trying to tell us something deeper? And they also had that large paper scroll as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, for me, that whole work was, I think, if I had to sum it up in one word, it would be fragility. It was trying to, for me at least, evoke the feeling of fragility and then bring that up as a conversation in display context. So I've thought about this a lot in terms of like more traditional displays in which you have trees lined up and you have the segmented spaces and stuff. And you could think about in one sense of like, okay, this is a great space to just do the traditional super well, because the traditional display model is yummy. I think it's really satisfying. It's very suggestive, it's very super quiet in its approach, which seems to be Japanese bonsai as a whole. It's like humble, quiet, be very like don't be too pushy about what you're trying to communicate if we interpret it Westernly. And so I think the traditional model is super, super yum because it's the metaphors are so sophisticated, which is great. But I don't see any problem in that being able to then be contrasted with things that are communicating other scenarios. So I think Aaron Packard's composition using that tree displayed on that concrete stand, tree and stand both had elements of absolute brutality, right? They're big. That tree was really interesting. It was I had a bit of it felt like a bit of an optical illusion to me because I don't know why, but I've seen pictures of that tree many a time. It's one of those few bonsai where it looks kind of tiny in a picture, but it's so large. It's like it had this really interesting large feel to it where it almost like grew as you walked towards it. It was very, very imposing. And I think that was a mixture of the fact that the tree, if you looked at its actual structural stability, was very fragile, but it was very large, very frontal facing, very full kind of foliage. So I had this mixture of being very, very brutalistic as well as delicate, dancey, and fragile all at the same time. And the concrete stand, also had that same feel, brutalistic in its materiality. Like concrete is like classic brutalist architecture vibe, big concrete facades, but also quite light because it had more of a shape that took on a lighter traditional bonsai stand form. So there's another contrast. And then you had the glass bubble underneath, which, it felt like water, so it felt fluid, but you knew it was glass, so it felt extremely fragile. Yet it was so well sandwiched under the stand, so it felt like it was meant to be there, like almost like it was supporting the very fragile and brutal elements of it. And then you had the paper behind it, which ultimately we know is a very fragile item, which, it took on, I guess, a metaphor for the scroll in terms of traditional display, but it was highly exaggerated, but very, very minimal in what it was actually trying to communicate in terms of visuals. So I think the whole display really, really was not trying to say anything in particular. I think it's very interpretive, but to me, it made me feel like this nice play with fragility and brutality all at the same time and showing how they can intermix. And I'm just thinking now I'm talking about it, I feel like maybe for me, the ultimate message of that work was talking about how you can combine elements of display and elements of appreciating bonsai that might harp more to, I hate to say the word traditional, but let's just use it, traditional display, what we're used to seeing in terms of what's our reference point of beauty, and also how we can actually have those same feelings and reference points, but using other materials and creating different feelings other than quiet and calm, but creating feelings of tension or fragility or brutality, aggression, happiness, sadness. Like all these things can be, I think, evoked through bonsai. And that tree kind of like that display nicely sandwiched all that together, but still presented something quite visually striking all at the same time.
So the scale alone of that scroll, also how just linear and straight it was in that little area, that little nook. It just, like you said, it sucked you in that kind of void, and it just that weird Willy Wonka effect, where it's like that small room, but it gets bigger as you. It's just
it was really, really fascinating. I enjoyed seeing that composition because I hung out in the Mirai booth quite a lot, and you could see it all the way down the room towards. It was the direct opposite corner of the room, and you could see it, and it just had this like, and through the day, the light coming through the paper, I thought was really engaging too. Yeah, it was. I thought it was really, really brilliant.
The show itself was awesome, just with the light play and everything. I mean, right? You gotta go to the next one.
Yeah, you do. It's fantastic. The light was so brilliant. I thought that was like, I don't think you could have planned for it, but incredibly ingenious, because you think about most shows that are indoors, the light is stagnant. It's the same. It stays the same. So the way in which you interpret the work in the show stays the same because there's no changeability. Where in that show, every time you walk through, it was a different experience. Some areas literally you couldn't see because the light would be blinding you and you could only see one side of the room. And then later there'd be these beautiful dances of shadows and the light was always changing. So the mood was always changing. And I feel like that's why that exhibition was so well attended, because anyone who was there subconsciously realized that they were having a different experience every time they walked up and down the roads. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I've seen the show. It was like, no, I haven't seen the show at 2:59 because it's different at 3:05. It's a totally different show. So people stayed and experienced it for a long time. So I think that was, it was really, really, really cool move, I think, for them to pick that venue.
Definitely. You were discussing, environment and how that plays into your role as a practitioner and things. And Ryan and I were discussing what's the environment of Australia. We don't know. Call us dumb, call us naive. Okay. We were in consideration of like, who's the best person to ask? Oh, Hugh. Okay, yeah, we got.
Well, you're the best person out of the three of us. Let's put it that way.
I was like, can you give us a? Well, Ryan, I know the question he was asking.
Well, what do you guys think?
I'll tell you my preconceived notion. So when I think of Australia, I think of the outback, and you got that big red rock, right? And I think this is definitely doing a disservice to Australia because it's not red behind you, but that's what I usually think of. And then, the contrast to that is you guys got the Great Barrier Reef. And then maybe that's about where my knowledge ends. So
Sure. Yeah. What about you, Kevin?
Limited as it is, my wife lived there for a while and taught Japanese. So I have that little bit of ease of information. I don't know, but she didn't travel much to nature.
Okay. Where did she live?
I want to say the Gold Coast. I'm not 100% sure. It was a long time ago for her. Okay. And she's in bed with the baby now. So another question for another day. No, I would say Gold Coast. I know Jared, what's his last name?
Bailey.
Yes, Jared Bailey. He lives Tasmania. Is that right? Yeah. So I know a little bit about that from his pictures. So what I've seen is based by picture, by influence. Call us Americans at heart.
I love it. Yeah. But, well, I mean, Australia is like the US, incredibly diverse in the environments that it has. Definitely a lot more arid, very arid environments, which I haven't actually spent a lot of time in. So, the reason why there aren't that many people who live here and not as many densely packed cities and towns all close to one another is because it's really only the outer kind of rim of the country that's that's nice, that's really, really easy to live in, let's say. Like the major desert kind of regions of the country probably cover I don't want to be like exaggeristic here, but I'm gonna say like maybe 3/5 of the country is like would be like, you know, the most inhospitable places in the States, you know, in some of those like western kind of desert areas. Imagine that being like most of the country. So you have that, which this is why I say I don't want to like exaggerate it, because within that there's so many different ecosystems and there's life that lives in all those places. I don't think there's many places that are void of life inside of that desert region. And all sorts of different environments. And a lot of that desert region is tropical, in fact, dry tropical kind of environments where it's super, super dry throughout the winter and then it floods in the summer, you know. Really, really interesting environments very up north, which I've only visited once. Very, very captivating, entirely different to this part of the country, entirely different. But like, you have a mixture of, you have that kind of environment, you have very Mediterranean kind of climates. You know, there's lots of Italian and sort of Greek communities in Australia who, you know, grow olives and wine. And so we have that kind of environment, which is pretty predominant in the south, southwest, central, and east is very much like that. And then as you move kind of up the east coast, you kind of move into like subtropical kind of climates. When you get to about Brisbane, which is a bit less than halfway up the east coast, that would be very similar to like Florida, I guess. And then you've got a couple of 1,000 kilometers north of that, which goes into like high tropics, where it's you know, cyclone kind of territory and super, super lush rainforests. And then it moves even up into dry tropical kind of zones, which are a different animal again, where it's, you know, basically a lot of the landscape's on fire in the summer, and then it's flooded in the winter. I mean, sorry, opposite way around, flooded in the summer and on fire in the winter. And then very, very down south in Tasmania, which is, you'd call the southeasternmost part of the country, and the southeast of the mainland Australia, around Melbourne, has a little bit of this kind of ecosystem, but it's very much what you'd consider like a cool temperate ecosystem. So similar to the Pacific Northwest, I would say. So the northeast of Tasmania, it's quite a big island. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to go from south to north. It'll take you a day to drive around it, so it's a good size. But the northeast is like kind of like the east coast where I am. It's kind of like, you know, it's not super rainy. Fairly Mediterranean. There's again lots of wine country around there. But then the sort of the other 3/4, the northwest, the southwest, and the southeast are very cool, temperate, borderline alpine climates up in the mountains. Very, very, very rugged kind of environment, and just absolutely beautiful, lush. You know, alpine rainforests everywhere. You know, it's one of the few areas in the country where conifers kind of predominate in some areas of the mountains of Tasmania, and it's the only place in which we have our only true colouring deciduous tree, called the Nothofagus gunnii. It's probably, I'm biased, but I think it's the most beautiful deciduous tree in the world. It just turns a golden retro orange colour in the autumn, cool. And it's super bizarre because nowhere else in the country do you see that as a native kind of environment that's untouched by exotic plants. So super special. So we have everything. And where I live is it's called the Blue Mountains. So it's at 2 hours west of Sydney, and Sydney is like kind of the most southernmost subtropical area. So you get pretty humid, hot summers, mild. Although a lot of people in Sydney will tell you it's not mild, but they definitely are mild winters. Most people in Australia gear towards warm rather than cold. I don't think a lot of people here know what cold really is. But in the mountains, I kind of like the mountains because you get all 4 seasons. So I live at about 1,000 meters elevation. So we're in a subtropical region, but because of the elevation, it's very much like some parts of Tasmania in a sense. So we get pretty cool winters. Even in the summers, the evenings are cool, although the days are quite hot. But I'd say it's a really interesting kind of area to live in. I imagine it would be very similar to maybe some of the elevated mountains parts of Arizona would be the way I'd compare it. Probably that's what I'm guessing, at least. Yeah. But yeah, we have every kind of environment in Australia, which is super super fascinating, except for Arctic. That doesn't exist. Yeah, we're not far enough south for that.
A little farther south.
Yeah, it needs to be a little further south. Yeah, Australia is interesting because we have ocean below us all the way to Antarctica. What that means is it actually warms the air as it travels from Antarctica up to Australia, and especially in the winters. So if we had land below us, like you guys have Canada above you, that's what makes America, although having similar latitudes, makes you guys a little bit cooler on average, because as that air travels across Canada, it cools it. Whereas the cold air travels across the ocean to Australia, actually warms it. So we get warmer temperatures, even though they're in similar places to the States. So yeah, I only learned that recently, and that kind of like blew my mind. I was like, that's why. Like, why is it so hot here all the time? That's why.
I'm sure that's a question you ask yourself every day, huh?
That's it.
But the reason that we wanted to ask about that and like try to understand what Australia is actually like in the environment is because obviously it's going to impact where you can find Yamadori, what type of Yamadori you can find, what are the Yamadori shaped like. So
yeah,
I'm a little curious, what parts of the country have you been collecting in so far? Or are there any, you can answer that, but also think, are there any parts that you haven't gone yet that you would like to go to collect?
Yeah. So I guess I can answer this question in two parts, because this allows us to talk about what type of species we have in Australia, and then the collecting side of things too. So the collecting scene in Australia isn't like super huge. Again, we don't have that many people who are doing it, and I guess when you think about collecting, you think about those kind of rugged forms coming from mountainous areas for sure, which in Australia, that is one thing we lack a lot of is high elevation areas, or like just mountainous undulating terrain in general. It's pretty minimal, and a lot of those really mountainous areas are a lot of the time very, very special World Heritage areas, national park areas. So a lot of those kind of trees are rightfully protected in those areas. But so the collecting scene in Australia is restricted basically to private property collecting, which there is a lot of course. And then there are ways to get permits from state forests, so forestry land, so forestry corporation who log areas and stuff, which is how Jared Bailey does a bit of collecting in Tasmania, and that's where he gets his permits from, which is a really, really great resource to be able to get cool trees in those sort of mellow mountainy environments. But yeah, the collecting scene here is very much focused on a lot of in-ground collecting. So I think a lot of the species we collect a lot of trees that are similar to deciduous trees, in which they can be hauled out of the ground easily with minimal roots, for sure. But yeah, just because of the lack of terrain in which gives you highly stunted trees is not as accessible, it just means our abundance of collected material available is less, for sure. But also, there's an interesting thing with the species that exist in Australia, and you'll hear it's kind of a bit jargonistic in terms of, in Australia, people kind of use this very broad banner of native. Oh, that's a native, right? Which means it's a plant that's Australian, right? And then we call everything else exotic, right? But there's can be a bit of a when people say that, I kind of really it puts my bee in a bonnet in a way when people say native, because it doesn't mean anything. When someone says, "Oh, it's a native," it's like, okay, so that could be a plant that exists in a really, really wet, high tropical location that's always warm, or it could be a temperate, borderline Arctic conifer growing in Tasmania. They're completely different things. What they need, what they require horticulturally, stylistically, visually, aesthetically, soil types, pruning rate, it's completely different. It's like saying, oh, like I use Japanese native trees and I do this. And it's like, well, no, you don't treat a maple like you do a pine. Like, so to say native is a very it's a misleading kind of thing to say. And even the horticultural industry in Australia treats it the same way. And I think this is where it comes from. Like, you can buy native fertilizer, right? Which basically means it's for Australian plants, right? Which there is a small amount of truth to it, because Australia is one of the oldest pieces of land in the world, in terms of the land that's been sitting here has been degrading and eroding for some of the longest time on the planet. So the soils are very, very leached and very degraded and very nutrient poor. So we lack a lot of phosphorus in our soils, and a lot of those heavier elements get leached into lower level areas. So some species are intolerant of some of those higher levels of, for instance, there's a few things, but phosphorus is kind of the one that gets all the fame. And so there are some species that are phosphorus sensitive or entirely intolerant. In terms of entirely intolerant, there's, I think, 12 in the whole country. And that's what the fertilizer is geared towards. Those 12 phosphorus intolerant trees. So it's more of a commercial thing, I think, than anything else. But the horticulture industry adopts that. There's plants, and then there's natives, right? And natives get pushed into this own category of their own right. Now, the thing that I think is valid, and this is where I sort of pivot from now, in terms of, if you were to generalize Australian native plants, I would say Australia is the land of the broadleaf evergreen tree, right? So if we think about deciduous, coniferous, broadleaf evergreen, most Australian native plants, and this is a true generalization, are broadleaf evergreens. So that's a huge differentiation between, from the lens of bonsai, what we practice with is a species set, because the Northern Hemisphere, I'd say, mainly focus with conifer predominantly, and then deciduous secondarily. I think that's a fair assumption to make. So in Australia, we mainly use, if we use our native plants, it's going to be 90% of the time, it's going to be broadleaf evergreens. Because as you know, we only have one deciduous plant, and we have a lot of conifers, a lot of different species actually, but very, very small in their utilization, and a lot more less regular on the landscape for sure. It's very much a broadleaf evergreen dense landscape. So that kind of changes the way in which everything happens horticulturally through general horticulture and through bonsai in Australia, because broadleaf evergreen trees are an interesting mix. I feel like they're a mixture between conifers, in terms of that they have a continually photosynthesizing leaf mass that is quite waxy. So it holds a lot of moisture, and only at times of growth does it transpire a lot of moisture. But it's always photosynthesizing all through the year, coupled with the actual mechanics of the same leaf type that a deciduous tree would have, which is that broad leaf shape. So broadleaf evergreens, if I had to draw a line across, I would put deciduous on one end, conifer on the other end, and I'll put broadleaf evergreens in the middle. So some broadleaf evergreens function more like conifers, and others function more like deciduous, but they have that consistency of the transpirational solar panel, that's just quite large and flat, but the waxiness and the continual photosynthetic action of a conifer. So a fun mix. So that kind of changes the way we have to deal with like collecting, because collecting broadleaf evergreens is a little bit more of a shifty business. You need a lot more roots generally per capita. You need really good intact root balls, unless they are very high water mobility species like a Japanese maple. So Melaleuca is a very high water mobility swamp growing tree generally, and they tend to be more easily collectible with minimal roots because of their high water mobility action, so long as you do it the right time of year. Then everything else is kind of a matter of being able to extract really, really, really good, solid, at times very large, compact root balls. So that limits what can actually be collected from the landscape a lot of the time, for sure.
So do you ever... Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, for Melaleuca, I've only seen pictures. I would like to see them in real life someday, ideally. But would you say, as an example for the states, would it be consideration like bald cypress, pond cypress, something like that, or Amur maple, where they grow in the swamp similarly? Okay.
Yeah, similar environment. For sure. Now, the reason I say not all Melaleucas, and this is another consistency among Australia, any genus that you select, a lot of the time there would be hundreds of species under that genus. So Melaleuca, I think, it might be 600 species strong alone. And and again, a lot of them are swamp growing, but there's also a good amount of them that are high arid, super dry growing Melaleucas. So that's why I say it's dangerous to generalize, but most people know Melaleuca is a swamp growing plant because a lot of them do grow in swamps for sure. But that's a consistency among Australian species. There's so many. It's not like, oh, there's 30 pines. It's like, no, I think there's 900 eucalyptus alone species.
It's a lot of ways to style up trees differently.
It's intense. Yeah, it's intense to think about because there's so much choice here in terms of species that you could play with, and not all of them are suitable for bonsai. Just inherently not from an aesthetic point of view, but just from a functional point of view. Some trees are harder than others and have similar aesthetics. So it's really a matter of choosing the species that are the least fussy while showing the aesthetic of the genus well and true. I think that's really the key because there's just so many. There's so many. It's intense. But I think that's just the nature of the beast when you have a landmass that is predominated by broadleaf evergreens. They diverge over time very, very quickly because of the flowering mechanism. Being mainly angiosperms, they can diverge pretty rapidly over millions of years, and you just get one genus that covers, like eucalyptus covers the whole country from the very tops of the coldest mountains in Tasmania all the way to the most driest deserts of the country. So they've covered everything. They've done it. They've taken over. They worked it out. Amazing plants, really.
There's some sort of term for that. I was a biology student in undergrad. There's some ecology term for when one species just diversifies into a million different roles based on finding new ecological availability. But if I were to retake that class, my professor would be disappointed that I forgot that. But some term exists.
Yeah. It's super fascinating. I almost think about eucalyptus like it's almost like you could in some lenses think about it like a weed on the landscape because they perpetuate themselves, right? So eucalypts, I mean, in California, I know they know about this pretty heavily, but they're very flammable. So when a eucalyptus dominates a landscape and then that landscape catches on fire, most modern eucalypt species are very reproductive after fire. One, the plant can resurrect straight from the trunk, quite happy, but the burnt ground gives a lot of nutrition and a lot of availability for new eucalypt seedlings to grow. So when they move into a eucalypt moves into an area and then it predominates and then it burns, it perpetuates itself. So they keep on spreading in a sense. Now, this isn't true for every eucalypt because there's some eucalypt species in decline because of fire. But, you think about a landscape that has been fueled by a lot of fire and you think about this species that does pretty well with fire and it's taken over most of the country. It's like, oh, wow. It's like, it's really taken over, literally. Just a curious thing I like to think about sometimes. I'm like, oh, yeah, interesting. It perpetuates its own, to at least humans, quite a destructive cycle, although it's part of the environment here, very much so. But it's a harsh way to take over an environment for sure.
With the fires. Oh, sorry, just real quick. With the fires, as we've been having really bad fires on the West Coast, predominantly Colorado burned really bad. Touch Slafer was talking about that a while back with me. Randy Knight was giving some input on that too. Is there any consideration, as I know here in the States, there's what they call the underbrush that's fueling the fire. They're trying to clear it out. So that's where they're trying to create a dynamic for the bonsai people to go collect it and be like, hey, let's reestablish, right? Is there anything in that approach in Australia right now?
Yeah, it's an interesting subject because I don't know if like underbrush removal as a tactic is something that's I don't know. Like, I don't want to put this out here and say I know, so I'm just going to say I don't know, but I feel like that's not really something that's considered here, because I feel like what's happening over your area, at least California areas, a lot of that's being removed in an attempt to like suppress the fire that was otherwise not there previously. Where here, the fire has been here for millions of years in that way. So the underbrush requires the fire just as much as the trees do for reproduction. So it's not really a destructive thing, though it is changing. There are fires that are getting so hot that they are not allowing those species to reproduce. So that's a problem. But that mentality of removing the underbrush, I don't think is just a part of the social consideration of the forest, because that's just, it's there to do that. There's a few species of acacia, so the wattle. There's some species in which their whole role in life is that they have a very short lifespan because they're fuel for fires. So they grow very quickly. They then get really, really sticky and daggy and lots of dead wood and lots of crap all over them. I'm talking 5-10 years. They create a lot of debris, and then fire comes through, burns all that debris. And then they're the first things that grow, and they grow really quickly and they create shade for the trees. And it's this cycle. So they're there to burn. their whole role in life is to burn. So
it's its own natural land management.
Yeah. And again, not all of Australia is like this. It's one of those generalizations. People think it's all desert and all burns, it's all on fire. No, there are there's rainforests. Like in my area, there's rainforests that if they burn, that would be a problem for that landscape. That's not a good thing, because they're not meant to burn. They're not designed to burn. But there is a good amount of the country that is designed to burn for sure. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask. So since you moved to the mountains, that area is like dense forest and not really subject to the fire, it sounds like?
No, it's a fiery landscape. It's a fiery landscape, yeah. It's predominantly, well, the thing is, it's predominantly eucalypt forest. It's one of the largest still intact eucalypt forests in the country, I believe, because it's quite rugged terrain. But it depends. A lot of the ridge lines are covered in eucalypt forest, and a lot of the large valley floors are covered in eucalypt forest. So it is technically designed to burn in some capacity. But a lot of the valleys and a lot of the cliff edges are rainforest, in which are not designed to burn. And a lot of those areas are what we call Gondwanan rainforest areas. So Gondwana is the landmass that used to be most of the southern hemisphere, which was like southern Chile, Argentina, and Antarctica, South Africa, I think, New Zealand, Australia. So that was when all of those land masses were together, and they were sort of a little bit further south all together, and they shared a lot of the same species. And it was a much wetter, rainforesty kind of world back then. And so a lot of the species you'll find in the Gondwanan rainforests of Australia are remnants from that time when the land masses were all joined together. So they're quite special little isolated ancient little spaces in terms of species that don't tolerate the modern conditions of Australia, and they just hide out in valleys and creek edges and cliff sides and in the shade kind of a thing. So those areas are the ones where it's like, oh, if that burns, that means that there's things are changing in the world for sure. The Blue Mountains is a good mix. Let's just say it's a really, really good mix. There's some areas where you'll be walking down a little mountain, sort of rocky creek, and you feel like you're in, up in the tropics in the north, because it's got these red rocks and it's all scrub around it, and there's lovely lushing water. It's hot, and then you'll go around into a valley, and you feel like you're in a Tasmanian rainforest, right down the south of the country. And so it's a very dynamic sort of space where a lot of ecosystems kind of meet up and hang out.
With this prevalence in your life of having these dynamic ecosystems and things, and then, I don't think it's that much of a jump, but from when you grew up in this environment, it's obviously led you to be the kind of person you are as an artist, or a person who sees nature in some way. How did that influence you to go want to study with, I know you studied with Ryan, because I think you were studying there when I was getting ready to move to Ohio, and I told my wife, I wish we were here a little longer. We could house the guy who needs a place to stay.
I see. Oh, that's cool. That's really
didn't
cool.
work out, but I wanted to put that out there, so we're thinking of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I love that our journeys were intertwined, and I didn't even know it. in some way,
It's like
potentially intertwined.
I think I may have seen you when you were working with Troy. I went there with Lion way back in 2018, and I just went in, popped in, and said hi real quick. I didn't know Ryan from 2 Ways from Sunday. Gave him a nice bottle of wine, thanks, and then lo and behold, we're here now, right? But back to my question was, growing up in these ecosystems and climates and understanding this natural nature prevalence in your life, how did that lead you to a study with him, or how about did it even come to fruition?
Yeah.
I mean, from Australia
kind of
and having that TV show with the guy established somewhat scene, and then choosing to come all the way to America.
Yeah. How I actually engaged with Ryan, not personally, but just from like how I found his work and why I was engaged to it, is really hazy. Is one part of that story where I'm like, all I can think of is just I used to just go on his website and I used to love his work, and I was following his work on social media and stuff from when he like first got back from Japan, like 2010. I think I was scouting around on his website, but I don't know how I got there. I have no idea. In my memory, it's just like, oh, I've just always known Ryan Neal's work. Like it's really interesting. So I can't answer that part. I wish I could, but I guess I just must have heard him sometime, saw a tree, thought it was cool, and led on from there. It's probably very humble. But I was always engaged by his work and his approach, and I think what struck me about his work was the flavor of it. It always had a very well constructed, well crafted, but also raw kind of feel, while being very personified. I always find his work, it has like an element, and Kimura's work has this too. It feels personified. You feel like you can feel the human in it while also feeling absolute raw naturalness at the same time. Like the forms have a quality that feel like sculpture in a sense, where sculpture often engages the human body. A lot of good sculpture that you engage with. Think about this next time you look at sculpture. Does it feel like you're interacting with another human being? Often are the most engaging sculptures because they personify themselves. So interesting little thing. But I feel like his trees always have done that in a sense, and have evolved over time for sure to take on even more of a relaxed, natural kind of feel, I guess. But yeah, I was always engaged by, I think later then I was engaged by his approach, how he spoke about his work, and how even just his horticultural groundings, and how he simplifies horticulture in terms of, again, comparing it to humans, and creating that relatability. But yeah, I think the continual pursuit of trying to create aesthetics that are still well constructed but embody absolute rawness at the same time is really where I get captivated by his work a lot. It's not trying to be one camp or another, it's just saying right. It's just like this is what the practice is. This is what the practice can do. Here it is. Don't put me in a camp. And so I really respect that, and I really resonate with that, because I feel like that's the way I like to function. So I think, these are all articulated thoughts after the fact, but I think that's why subconsciously I was attracted to his work at first. Nice. And why I wanted to engage in trying to form a greater relationship, and obviously learn from him,
Right. With Ryan's story, as we've all probably heard, with him studying in Japan and coming back and trying to utilize certain techniques on an American species, didn't play out so well. Did that also happen with your aspect of working with natives? And I use those in quotes, as you said, it's very broad.
Yeah. Well, it's
did those you worked on Native American landscape geographical trees, right? Rocky Mountains, junipers, all those from the Americas, bringing those certain aesthetic features, but also horticultural knowledges. How did you apply that to your own native species in Australia?
That's a fun journey. That's actually a journey I've been trying to unpack ever since 6 years ago, and I'm still unpacking. So there was a few scenarios I can talk about. So one scenario is when I first came back from that stint of spending time with Ryan, I I was inspired. I immediately styled a few trees I'd been wanting to style for ages. One of them was a very tall, lanky Melaleuca, and I laid out the foliage mass very similar to the way I would lay out a juniper, right? And it looked really cool. And I had my post grad show for university when I got back, because it was delayed by 6 months. You don't do it as soon as because basically I finished uni and then I went straight to Ryan's, I think within 3 days. Yeah. Wow. And when I say finish uni, finished my last class, but I still had the grad show to do 6 months later. But so I had this Melaleuca. I wanted to display it in the grad show. I did. And it was the foliage. It looked cool. It looked really, really, I was really happy with it. But over time, that design failed very quickly because this species is a broadleaf evergreen. It has a very up and out aesthetic of foliage, and the foliage was down and flat, right? And it responded and it changed and it became something else because it reacted to the actions that I'd put into it, So it still became a really interesting tree, but there's nothing like what it was styled as, right? So it probably took me about 2 or 3 years to slowly unpack that, because I had this mentality of like, this is how you lay out a tree. And it was very much an egocentrical thing, because I was like, no, this is how you lay out a tree. This is how you lay out a tree. I just do it like that, and it would keep failing. And then, for lack of a better term, I'd be an egocentric bastard and be like, no, I'm just going to keep doing it, But I recognize that now as like, I needed to exercise that because I had to see it fail enough, and I had to really see it fail to go, okay, I've got to change something here because there's some species specificity here. And later that led me to understand that, broadleaf evergreen as a category of plant requires a different frame of reference of how you understand the functionality of the plant. Much like conifer to deciduous, we understand there's a difference not only in aesthetics, but just how those aesthetics actually function. Like, you take a deciduous branch up and out because it has a flat solar panel, which is the leaf, and it functions more on a vertical fashion. You take that below the horizontal, the actual gravity mechanics just don't function as well all of the time as it does with a conifer, in which its mechanics are geared towards that a lot of the time. There's exceptions to all those things, of course, but just as a generalization. So with a broadleaf evergreen, I had to solidify in my head that the mechanics here are different from not only functional perspective, but that then becomes an aesthetic perspective also. And I literally had to like go through that, but that's how I've always learned. I always learn by trial by fire. I push and push and push until everything breaks down around me, and then I go, all right, that's how it goes. And that's just how I've always functioned with things. You get better at that over time. Yeah, that's it. So interesting. And then just to finish that thought, I think then over that time I was making work that slowly tapped more into, it happened sort of through the Kunzia. I started exploring Kunzia a lot when I came back from that first stint in America, because it was kind of a new species I was playing with at that time. And it kind of bridged the gap for me between trying to style all these broadleaf evergreens like conifers and trying to style these broadleaf evergreens more like broadleaf evergreens, because Kunzia have this interesting up and then flat aesthetic. So they kind of go up and then out flatly. So I styled them like junipers at first and it didn't work. But then I got to play with, okay, now if I orient these branches structurally up and then flatten them out, now the designs work. And all of a sudden they look really nice. Oh, they look unique, but they look right. They look like they're happy and they're justified in their shapes. So that was kind of the bridge for me. And that allowed me to then go like, okay, right. Specificity is extremely important. But it doesn't mean that you can't still apply techniques derived from other species or other countries at all. It's the concepts that you need to take on board,
right?
Not literally translating it. Because so many people ask me that. They're like, I know a lot of people in Australia, they'll be like, I don't really like watching Mirai videos or watching Northern Hemisphere videos because the species aren't the same. And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. You don't want someone there saying, here's what you do with this and here's because that's not bonsai. Bonsai is being reactionary and collaborative with the plant. So you can take the concepts of those trees, of those techniques, and rehash them to then create the same aesthetics, but in a different format. Or take those functional horticultural keys and twist them to suit the format of the tree that you're working with, but the concepts stay exactly the same, I believe, in my mind. The very overarching concepts, at least.
So then have people that you've taught or come to learn from you, as you've been doing this for a while now, have you noticed a difference in how they perceive you? Like when you first went back after you studied Ryan, finished the show, maybe studied a little more of Ryan, they're expecting a certain stylistic approach. Like, oh, well, you studied with this person, why don't you do that? Or now you're like, oh, you found your own piece of the cake, completely different, more native zest, if you will.
Yeah.
Is that any consideration there?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone's like, I don't know if anyone actually like attaches my work to Ryan's work in a literal sense, in a way. But I think people do when it comes down to like finickiness. So like attention to detail for sure. I often get, but that's bonsai, you know, at the end of the day, attention to detail is a big part of it. But I was hanging out with a few friends. We went to a barbecue on the weekend, and we're all hanging out. A few young people who practice bonsai in Sydney, and we're all having a Christmas barbecue. And we're at this guy named Matt's house, and he's showing me a few trees, and he's like, "Oh, this is a Hugh tree. I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Oh, it's got a Hugh flavor to it." And it was this very whimsy, line-based, elongated type juniper, and he's like, "Oh, this is a Hugh tree." And then they all started cracking on about Hugh trees, and I was like, what's this Hugh tree thing?
That's awesome though, because it's representing like your impact. You know, like Dan Robinson's got his gnarly trees, and other people. That's what I wanted to know, because I'm like, it's gonna happen.
I battle with that because it's kind of like, I don't know. I'm the kind of person, I don't really like too much attention drawn to myself, I guess. Right. But it's just like I always just like shy away from it slightly. I try and lean in though. I think it's important to lean into those things, but I naturally like shy away slightly. But it's interesting because I think yes, a lot of people do and have and will gravitate towards my work because there's something that is unique about it. And I think that unique thing, if I had to put it in my own terms, is that I just like to work very passively with trees. So I like trees that have more line. One, because the Australian landscape offers that. If you think about what is a defining aspect of Australian broadleaf evergreen trees in Australia, and what is the predominant kind of form you see, it's a very line-based, proportionately a lot thinner trunk to height design to a lot of the trees, even in the ancient form. So to me, I think my aesthetic uniqueness, or what I offer aesthetically, is me trying to very literally translate the broadleaf evergreen Australian native environment in general. So yeah, I feel like it's just me really leaning into that rather than kind of treating that like it's something that's more reserved for, because you hear a lot of people talk about a line-based tree, and this is why I say line-based, because I think a lot of people instantly gravitate towards Bungian or literati aesthetics. But line-based doesn't have to be Bungian or literati. It's just a stretching out of the same form that you'd see in a more condensed tree. You know, you're just literally stretching out those proportions. So you're making the trees not even necessarily narrower in a very line-based tree, but just more negative space is involved than positive space, because you're stretching. And I think that's the key, to think about stretching the design as opposed to trying to make the same compact form in all sizes.
So you can actually look at the line as opposed to hiding it.
Yeah,
I think
is
the best example of that is literally the trees right behind you. I've been looking at those as you've been talking about that. Yeah. I was like literally right there.
Yeah, I'm literally in a eucalypt. It's a park, but it's a nice eucalypt forest. Young. These are probably 10-year-old trees, but
yeah, and in no way did I hope you didn't think I was like, oh, but you're like Ryan, you're like Ryan. I wanted to say in follow up, like I think when I officially met you in person at the Bonsai Expo, I think I told you it was such a crazy event. High energy. You don't remember what you said to
Yeah,
everybody,
I
right?
know.
But I think I told you that I had a really big breakthrough on how to style the outward line for branching, secondary and then tertiary,
Yeah,
right? I think we
yeah,
discussed that because I've seen it happen. I've seen it work. I've seen it done so many times here. But then
yeah,
just that one moment where you said it, and I think you related to like a maple or something in the States. You're like, oh, in the States, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense now. It's just like bing,
mm,
light click, okay,
mm,
light on. Now I
mm,
get it. So now I see my
mm.
own work in symmetry. So again, thank you for that, because it was just like that
No
moment of
worries.
clarity
Yeah,
where I was just like, it's that simple. Okay.
yeah, yeah. And that's the thing. Like when you style like, and again, these are all generalizations, but if you take a down and out branch of like a pine or a conifer, and you have that pad structure, that exact same structure, and this is what I tell all my students: if you're making a broadleaf evergreen that has a really up and out structure, it's the same structure formulaically, how it's pruned, etc. It's just where is the orientation of that structure that
Hmm,
changes.
hmm,
And this is why I say, like, it doesn't really matter if you connect with someone's work, even if they're not using the same species, take their concepts and adapt it to the species you're working with. Because bonsai, at the end of the day, as a practice, so it's kind of complicatedly simple. Like what you actually are doing is very simple and mechanical, but
hmm.
it's the translation of that becomes the complicated piece, I think.
Definitely. That's a good way to put
Species
it.
specificity and aesthetic specificity, but actually how you construct physically things from a concept point of view is the same. It's exactly the same from every species. Just where do you orient those branches? How do you display that foliage? Blah 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 blah. But the mechanics are the same.
Do you,
I'm a,
so this may be a little bit of a contradictory question in the sense that I want to ask you, do you think it's easier to teach your students with native species where you can go out into the forest and say, okay, look at that tree, see how those branches are, even though there's
Mm.
less established techniques for working with those species, so that part may make it more difficult. But from the stylistic component, is it easier
Mm.
to impart that knowledge onto students with your native species?
Oh, yeah, that's it. It kind of goes both ways, like your question asked, in a sense, where it depends on who the person is. I think is if it's someone who's, and I like to break down bonsai into the two ways. One, and this is a contentious thing to talk about, but this comes from my art background. But there's appropriation,
Mhm.
or there's reflection, right?
Oof,
So,
oof.
I didn't know you guys had that
I-
term in Australia. I thought
It's
that
a
was a
world.
US thing.
It's worldwide.
Yeah, no. Well, this is why I say it's contentious, because when you say appropriation, everyone goes, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
who are you going to slander right now?" But appropriation is a very big topic of art
Well,
and
it's just
fine art.
it's just when you know the
It's
Americans are in the room.
yeah, that's yeah, that's it. Fantastic. But it's I mean, all Westerners are appropriators in some sense. I think that's
Mm,
what defines Western culture a lot of the time. In one sense. But appropriation is a really big canon of art, in which you are taking cues or taking inspiration or taking literal elements or entirely mirroring something also from the art world to then communicate a new message, right? And it's not a taboo thing to do. It's a part of the canon, right? It's a very important part of the canon, because it allows for the metaphor of art not just to be about other things, but for art to critique itself. Um, and that happens, I think, naturally when an art form or a craft evolves through space. So, bonsai seems to change and adapt as it changes through cultures. And those cultures obviously are reflecting and adapting to what bonsai is ultimately communicating, which is the tree, which is in the environment. So bonsai is a translation of space through culture. Um, so appropriation, I believe, in the bonsai context is when you are in Australia or you are in America and you are not if you're referencing Japanese bonsai as your mecca, then if you take a Shimpaku juniper and you are American or you are Australian and you live in a place that isn't the place of the Shimpaku juniper, and you try and make that Shimpaku juniper look like a Shimpaku juniper from Japan, technically, stylistically, etc., even if it looks exactly the same, that inherently, due to the cultural space and the physical space, is different. It's not the same thing. It's appropriated, right? And again, that's not a negative term. I say appropriation from an endearing perspective, because it's you commenting on and actually showing admiration for that art form, because you're putting it on a pedestal. You're saying, I love this Shimpaku juniper that these Japanese people have created. It's a species from there. This form is from there. The techniques I've used are from there. And I'm placing this in America, and I'm going to show it in the best I can. That is amazing. And that is a real testament to the craft, and it shows respect and all that. But it is technically an appropriation. Again, a positive thing. So when I teach students, I don't always communicate this to them literally, because some people do take offense to it. I hate that appropriation does this, but I think, are you someone who wants to learn because you are interested in appropriating Japanese bonsai or Chinese bonsai, whatever it is? Or are you someone who wants to use the same skills and techniques to reflect their own culture and their own environment, right? And that's the flip side of that is, are you using bonsai as a mechanism to understand your environment, which I believe the Japanese, because you see Japanese, they don't hardly ever use species that are not native to Japan. Like when you think about it like that, they're using their own species. It has become our reference point because they do it very well, and it's very beautiful, and it's highly crafted. And that's what happens when something becomes respectable. People want to appropriate it so that they can understand it and evolve from there. So when I think about teaching different students, or even in my own work, I'll look at a tree and I'm like, do I want to use this tree as an appropriation tool to further understand that aesthetic and further exercise that? Or is it a student? Do I want to help them to be able to exercise that and further understand that and create the best possible appropriated tree possible? Or are they someone who wants to reflect the environment around them and understand using bonsai as the tool in which they do that, which I believe is what the Japanese are doing when they use their own trees, because they're using their own species that they see in the environment. They're then culturally adding their own aesthetic to that, but it's ultimately the aesthetic of Japan. So, and
Not
you see
just
them
the
do that
aesthetic.
maybe some.
Oh, sorry.
Not
I was going to say, so they're not just adding the aesthetic of Japan, but they also, to bring it full circle, they display it in the context of Japanese symbols and Japanese accent plants and Japanese scroll paintings. It just kind of makes me think that there's so many different divergent options for presentations that we could still explore. Absolutely, but still using the same underlying reason. It's exactly the same reason, but it just might translate visually different because you're literally trying to translate a different experience. And in that sense, if you understand that, you're doing the same thing. I think when you say, if I take a eucalyptus and I create a beautiful proportional bonsai out of it that shows some sort of emotion from the environment in which I'm trying to display, it's species specific, it shows culture through the way I display it with the pot, and maybe the way in which I pair it with something else, still harping towards traditional models, but using elements that are of my own country and of my own culture, blah, blah, blah. To me, that is more truly bonsai than me getting a Shimpaku juniper and trying to make a Japanese display in Australia. Like, you hear what I'm saying? Like that is bonsai, where the other is trying to replicate or appropriate someone else's culture and someone else's, which again is entirely appropriate. It's beautiful. It's lovely. I do it. I have trees that I do that with, because you've got to, you can't just, I don't think you can just go and maverick out. I don't think that's the point.
I think my wife said
but that's what's happening in my mind.
Yeah. I think my wife said it the best is, when we moved out here, she told me two things. She's like, you've had a farther different experience than most people probably in bonsai in America nowadays, as far as your age group, because of the fact that you were from Oregon grew up in that kind of Mecca scene over there where they were influencing so much. And then coming out here, East Coast influenced, you're having that more certain approach to be that traditional aspect, right? In the influence of that, not that it's good or bad, it's just there. Based on teachers, you got John Naka, the West Coast, and Yuji Yoshimura, East Coast, right? She then follows up, says, you need to know both, because if you don't know the traditional sense and know your basis of ground and foundation, then you have nothing to go off of, and you're just making weird looking trees. It's like,
Absolutely.
yeah. And she's like, it's not appropriating culture because you're paying respect to the culture. The only way you're going to appropriate culture is by not showing that respect in regards to doing something completely opposite of what the culture granting you to do. I was like,
yeah,
you're really smart.
yeah. That's it. Yeah.
She gives me a lot of those little knowledge drops, like mic drop a lot. I was like, cool.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And she puts it well. And this is where that appropriation word just becomes contentious, because like it's again, it's a contextual word. You know, in the art world, it's an appropriate form of the canon, but in just normal day to day, it's used negatively to connotate things. But
do you have another word in mind that you could use outside of the art context in the art world?
You just said something. That's why I started bringing it up again. But you just said something that I was like, yeah, that's another way you could put it. What did you just say?
Brian?
I don't know which word you're thinking that he said, but I could come up with some synonyms. Kind of like borrowing concepts from the other culture, or repurposing in a way, like maybe not always repurposing. Sometimes you're more like just taking it and that's like your foundation, and not changing it quite as much as repurposing kind of implies.
Or showing respect.
Yeah.
Respectively reiterating.
Yeah.
There you go.
The concept is there.
Yeah.
We've Hughfied it. There you go. Hughfied it.
Hey, there you go. Like Hughism.
There you go.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, super power. I love this topic. I find it I really like the semantics of bonsai, in a sense, and how it can.
It's funny.
Yeah,
it's real funny sometimes. It's finicky.
Yeah, and there's one kind of similar thing on this topic that I'll bring up. Then we can maybe move on to the next thing. So I just have a little bit of a problem with kind of using too much of that Japanese foundation outside of Japan. You know, if you're using Japanese symbols and displaying to an American audience, the American audience, the public who usually is at these shows, might not know what you're trying to convey. And then that kind of is a barrier to their understanding and interaction with the art in a way, because then they're like, oh, that's cool, but they don't know the significance behind it. Whereas if you use more local symbols or more local things that have meaning to those people that are in the audience in Australia or in America, then you can get more penetration of whatever your chosen metaphor or image is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And I think it goes back to the whole thing of, you know, if you're like, in bonsai is inherently coming from an Eastern Oriental perspective, right? Inherently. So if you adopt bonsai as a practice, I think it's because of that's origin, it's important to exercise in that aesthetic and that origin, because that allows you to then gain insight as to why you would even do anything other than that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you're going to be an abstract painter, you kind of need to learn how to just paint really well first. You know? Like, how do you actually apply a stroke to a canvas, and how do you actually make that stroke visually represent something else through color first, before you use those colors to then abstractly speak about something else. I think it's like the same as bonsai. I think you need to exercise the reference point to some extent first, because that is what, as the word implies, reference point allows you to then jump off of and then adapt those aesthetics and adapt that representation a little bit more. But I hear what you're saying, in that, like, I think it is more appropriate, ultimately, to reference in American things in display, for sure, straight up. because again, that goes back to what I said before. I think that's truly doing bonsai then, more so than trying to copy another way of doing bonsai out of context.
So it's the same that how Japan oriented penjing to bonsai back in the day. How we are trying to compromise, not compromise, but also procreate this thing for nationality in response to nature.
Yeah. I mean, if that lineage is true, which I believe, there's a lot of truth to it, that they saw bonsai in China and thought, for a simple story, thought it was cool and thought they would appropriate it themselves, and then turned it into their own aesthetics and they have their own ideals. And now we look at that and we distinctively see differences. But that distinction comes through, originally it would have been copying. It would have been literally taking those trees and bringing them to Japan and admiring them, and then seeing how they could evolve and seeing how their material could adapt to that, and over time the distinction becomes different. And I think, you see that in Western cultures starting to form. I mean, the PBE was a great show to actually see that, because you saw a mixture of, Native American trees. You saw non-native American trees grown entirely in America. So that's kind of like a little middle ground there. And you saw Japanese trees, and you saw a mixture of all different display methodologies and avant-garde display methodologies and cross-pollinations of, native tree with Japanese aesthetics, and Japanese aesthetics with a non or American aesthetics with a non-Japanese. You saw all of it. So that mishmash is I think the beginning point of seeing that kind of understanding of what you're trying to achieve out of the art form. And through that understanding, that's when you actually now have a diving board to go off. Because if you understand that, what you're doing, like how I had coined it before, appropriating or reflecting, if you understand that, well, now you have clarity, and now you can make clear, decisive decisions, and you can communicate better because of that understanding.
Right. No, it's interesting that you say that too, because there's also the component of having certain institutions in place, say be clubs, museums. I know you guys have the National Museum, I believe, for the bonsai collection you guys have there, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Sam works there.
Yeah, Sam Thompson, the assistant curator there.
I want to meet him someday. I got one of his pots. Gnarly pot.
Sam's a legend. I love Sam.
We have clubs here. We have Bonsai Society of Portland. We have our local club in Columbus that Ryan and I are part of, and then you have bigger, the American body clubs like American Bonsai Society and that. Do you know, or are you part of, or the inner workings or anything of the Victorian Native Bonsai Club, or how that works or anything?
Oh, I've done a lot of work with them over the years. They were actually one of the first clubs outside of like my local region who would ask me to come and do like lectures, demonstrations and stuff. So I have a really a close affection for that group. Nice. I think they're fantastic. Yeah. But they're just a regular sort of club who dedicate themselves to promoting and using native plants over using other plants. So the really simple concept functions just like a normal club. It's just Australian trees only, and every topic is only about Australian trees. So it's a great little hub.
So it is it's more of a local club then. I was imagining when I first heard about it in Ryan's podcast, I was imagining that it was like all of Australia natives club, where like somehow people from around the country were involved in it.
Okay, so it is just a local Melbourne club. So Melbourne's a city in the very southeast of the country. So it's a club that exists there, but they have held a lot of nationally significant events, which has made the club inclusive of the nation entirely. So they hosted. So we have an organization called the AABC here, the All Australian Bonsai Clubs, so combined kind of thing, and they have an annual convention. And that annual convention travels to different host clubs. So it's kind of like the Olympics. You put in a bid, and you win the bid to host the event. And so they hosted it once. So it was hosted in Melbourne by the Victorian Native Bonsai Club. So the convention naturally and natively was all natives. So it was all native trees, it was all native exhibition and all native workshop sessions. All the lectures are about native plants. So they really used their club as a vehicle to they used the convention as a vehicle to promote what they do as a club for sure, and exercise that use of native plants as bonsai. And I think what that event did really importantly was make it seem like native plants as bonsai isn't this other thing. It's just bonsai. It's just bonsai, just done in the context of Australia. And that was, I think, the most important thing that convention did. Because it said, like, here's our national convention, there's Australia, and we're going to use native plants. Like, that seems so appropriate, like
right.
a convention in Australia. So that was fantastic. And that was an event that Ryan came out for. He which is probably why you hear him spoke about it on the podcast, like he said. So he was headlining it as the international. I was doing the local demonstrator role. And we just busted out and worked on some cool native plants. So that was a really important event. And they also actually again, disclaimer, I don't know if they do host this or they've run it before, but there's a native symposium. I don't think they are a part of it, but they've hosted it before. So it's a symposium that happens every year, a very small event, but it travels kind of between Canberra. I think they host it sometimes in Melbourne. Yes, they do. And in Tasmania. It's just like a little event, basically a native plant symposium, a smaller convention, I guess, just like a day, and people exhibit trees and do lectures about native plants, and sort of everyone just gets excited about native plants as bonsai. So so there's a few little things, which is great, really, really great.
Awesome. We should copy and get some kind of a native symposium over here. It seems
absolutely.
A lot of people on the West Coast are using, of course, the mountainous Yamadori. But then once you get to the central US and eastern US, there's less native representation. I mean, people are still using those like Rocky Mountain natives, but less. Like in our recent Columbus show, there was only one tree there that was native to Ohio. There were other trees native to America, but they're more native to the Rocky Mountains, which is 30-hour drive from here. So how native is that? I always think about this in terms of the Northern Hemisphere and native plants, because I think when we here in particular look at the Northern Hemisphere, which is Europe, America, Asian countries as references for bonsai, I think a lot of the time we gloss over the fact that you guys, especially Europe, are using a lot of your own native plants. But the reason we gloss over it is because they're junipers, pines, spruces, maples of some kind, hornbeams of some kind. They're all similar genuses. So at a glance, it's like, oh yeah, they're all similar-ish to plants used in Japan. They're all pines, or whatever. So we're here, we don't have any of those genuses at all. None. It's a whole entirely different inventory of native plants. So I think when people think about native plants here, it gets put in this like other category because it is other compared to what the Northern Hemisphere has. So, but I find that interesting that you say even in those sort of more eastern and central areas, you still don't see many American native plants, even though you guys seem to have some of the best material that seems to exist on the earth over there, which is quite phenomenal.
I think it's also a thing too, is that there might be, but we just don't see them because they're in people's backyards.
Sure.
And the best bonsai are in the people's backyards that never show, right?
And
that saying goes, and also too, there is a correspondence we've been collecting since Ryan moved here. Well, you've been here 3 years now, I think. 2, 3. I've been here 4 already. Wow. Time flies.
There it is.
And collecting in this environment is a lot different than what we were used to collecting in the Pacific Northwest. Like I said, Ryan was living in Washington State and Seattle. I was in the Portland area, grew up outside of there.
Yep.
Different soils, different everything, but also it's highly deciduous over here. It's not.
Yes.
You have pitch pines, you have other pines, but it's or not pitch. Is it pinyon?
Pitch is here. Pinyon is like southwest, I think, southwest U.S. But
Okay, yeah.
We digress.
Either way, it's more pine based and more deciduous based, and I think there's possibly correspondence with. I don't want to make an assumption, you know what that means, but I think there's maybe more of an idea based on teaching, like I was saying, early on in America, that East Coast was more traditional in the sense of the teaching in response to bonsai, but also that maybe there's some things that are just not being applied to the native material here to make it work aesthetically.
Sure,
you know what I mean? Because they're hard to work on here because the leaves are sometimes so big. You got to try to figure out if they'll condense and reduce, and you know, horn beams, we got a bunch, but it's like what takes what kind of year, seasonality. Plus, I don't know, doing bonsai in the middle of America or East Coast can be really hard because of how cold it gets. You know, the growing season is by far less than the West Coast, even the East Coast in certain parts. Like we hit winter sometimes in October and then goes till, you know, April or May, maybe June. I haven't experienced that yet, but I've heard stories, you know. And that right there, just who was it? I think it was Bobby Curtright said, you guys living in the Midwest and the East Coast really want to, like, you got to want to do bonsai to do it out there. And I was like,
see what you guys have to do in the winters and things like that to just get your trees. Like, it's a lot.
It's, you know, but then, you know, like yourselves, you know, you guys have different aspects too. Fires, heat, more tropical, like you said, different things there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's worthwhile because to investigate those native species heavily, because I mean, even from the perspective of like, you know, they'll grow well in your area.
This is true.
Because they grow well in your area. Yes. I think that is a really big key point about using native plants is like they will tolerate your area because look at them. They're out there. They're growing over your bonsai collection as well as in your bonsai collection. Well, obviously they'll do okay.
There's the thing with that too, though. I think people have run into as well, maybe in consideration to what we just talked about. They may work in the landscape, but how well do they work in the container?
Yeah, it is an inherently different thing for sure.
You know what I mean? And also soil-based media. What do you use? You know, what are you guys using in Australia? Are you guys using the traditional Akadama pumice lava? Or are you guys using different?
That kind of became a really big thing here about 5 years ago, because it became available. So that's kind of what we've been playing around. Well, I at least, and the community that I sort of have around me, I've been playing around with a lot. Playing. It definitely works. It works really great for Japanese species, right? Yeah. Obviously because it's Japanese soil, literally came out of the ground in Japan. So inherently, and that's been my understanding lately. It's like, oh well, of course that works so well for them because it's their dirt. It's the same dirt that those plants are growing in. But it's been for me using soil. It's been like a slow process of adapting mixtures, ingredients, etc. for different species. The biggest thing I've kind of realized lately around soils, and it's kind of been something I've kind of kicked into this spring, was just thinking about the locations in which some of these species come from just a simple perspective of, is it highly rich, leached into soils, or is it highly degraded, granular, not necessarily higher elevation in terms of like mountains or non-mountains, but just like, are those trees growing in more highly draining areas, like on sandstone, or are they growing at the bottom of the sandstone, where water accumulates? And for me, I think that's been a big sort of eye-opener, because I've had trees that grow in those more sandstone-y kind of environments, and I've had them in soils that maybe aren't suited to that, so they need potentially deeper soils so that they have more drainage and more accumulation of aggregates in the soils. I don't have any answers. I'm just sort of fluffing around here, but that's kind of thought processes I've been on lately. I've seen some failures. Yeah. But
it's good. I mean, you got to experiment, right? I mean, that's what life's about, especially in
Absolutely,
this scientific art. We call it bonsai.
exactly.
And no, I mean, we've been doing some experiments as well with the material we have here. Ryan and I think we started last year or 2 years ago, where we've been trunk shopping and then seeing how many back bud branches are appearing lower at the trunk where we chop.
Yeah, kind of doing some preparation and seeing like what type of preparation can we do for these trees in the forest that and what is the best time to do that preparation to get
seasonally,
the best result. Yeah.
It's like we have a patch
Yeah.
where we've done it in like autumn, and then we have a patch where we've done it in like early, late
In
winter, spring,
Yeah.
or one in summer, and
Yeah.
it's going to take probably another year to figure out what works
Yeah.
best, but we don't have all the time in the world to drive 2 hours south.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the key, isn't it? You got to have that those numbers to experiment on so that you can understand technique. But I think this is also where what comes in is looking at species that are similar, that have been exercised, that do have those traditional like, I don't know, if you've got hornbeams that are native, obviously referencing Japanese or Korean hornbeams or European hornbeams is going to be a great starting point to jump off of, rather than just going in entirely blind.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Too and everything.
Or even thinking a little bit more laterally, and not necessarily going for same genus, but going for what are the actual growth attributes that are similar. So, for example, here, this has nothing to do with collecting or anything, but there's a species called Crumnopioides laddii. So it's really, 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 really.
I think we lost it, Hugh.
Oh no.
Oh, we're back.
Am I back?
It jumped.
There we go.
Hey, I just went and jumped in my car to charge my phone because it's it's starting to run out of battery. But where the car is sitting,
I was wondering about that.
Oh,
that's why I was sitting up in this. Yeah, it's all good. I've got enough juice to go for a little bit longer, but
it's getting late over here too. We'll figure we'd want to ask one last question just for tonight. We'd love to have you on again. This is a great conversation. I mean,
fascinating.
I could do
lots of ideas.
This is awesome. Like, this is I know Ryan and I are gonna be like, this is more fuel to our fire now, changing the approach.
No, I'd be happy to chat anytime. This is great.
I feel like we could have Hugh on 10 more times and still not run out of things to talk about.
100%.
I love that. But back to before I got cut off there, the Promnopioides, the story I was trying to, so it's this really rare conifer, blah, blah, blah. It has a similar kind of leaf morphology to like a mixture between a redwood and a taxus, I guess.
Is that the Quincy?
It has not. No, this is a Promnopioides. So it's called the I think North Queensland black pine, they call it.
Oh, okay.
It's a really rare conifer. It grows at high elevation. And really interestingly, you can't grow it in the area it comes from because it grows at high elevation. It's actually not a tropical plant. It just got stuck there millions of years ago. So it struggles to grow in that area. So you got to take it further south to grow it at low elevation. Fascinating. But the way in which it grows, even though it has no genetic similarity to taxus or redwood or anything like that, the way in which I've discovered to prune it and to manage its foliage mass is exactly the same as like mainly a taxus, really. And so it's just a nice little example of like, okay, there's no genetic similarity, but there's the foliage and the functionality of the plant has adapted to find the same ecological niche as taxus has. So the pruning methodology becomes the same because it's functioning on the same level. So totally different plant, but you can gain the same techniques by referencing other plants that you already know of. That's kind of the point I was making there.
That's what's cool, and especially with the ecological factors of growth and to keep it alive.
Yeah,
like that's a trip.
Yeah, sometimes just environment or literally how does the foliage function can be the indicators of technique of a similar species that does the same thing, but it might have no correlation genetically to the other species. Yeah.
Good old-fashioned convergent evolution. This is a term I actually remembered.
Hey. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
One question I like to always ask before we, graciously say thank you and allowing us your time, especially with the 16-hour difference I think we're on.
Yeah, something like that.
What's one thing that keeps you going every day, that keeps you wanting to keep doing this art, or keeps you just wanting to approach this in the way that you're approaching it?
Okay. You know what? This is a topic I could talk about for a long time, maybe another podcast. But in simplicity, yeah. Because for me lately, what I've realized keeps me going is community, for sure. Just interacting with other like-minded people for me has become extremely important in why I not entirely why I practice bonsai or what keeps me going, but it's a big part of it. I think sharing, interacting with other like-minded people, really, I found it to be extremely important to my practice. Because for a long time there, I was, I'm a bit of a romantic, right? So I very much get sucked into that idea of, the solo artist in their studio churning out work, and it's all happening. And I did that for a while. And
gets lonesome, doesn't
it? Didn't really like it. And over time, I would become less and less enthusiastic about bonsai. And my thing in the last literally in the last 12 months has been like, get out into the community, put yourself out there, create good relationships. And not that I wasn't before, but it's become a priority for me. Like coming back from America, like I spent a lot of that time just not like skill building in terms of physical bonsai skills, not that much, but I spent a lot of time socializing and making connections and talking with like-minded people. And through that, I learned a lot and gained a lot of insight and motivation to step forward to the next day and each day after that, trying to progress, So that's a big thing for me. And also being able to inject myself out into the landscape more. That's a huge motivation for me. Like, that one sounds very obviously cliche to bonsai, but I think it's very, very important for me, and I think for a lot of people too, because it reminds me why am I doing this practice? Why am I doing it as a job? Why do I dedicate so much of my time to it? It's, for me, it's not necessarily because I actually enjoy practicing bonsai, because like, if I'm really honest, I find it a bit of a grind most of the time and kind of really hard. Like I don't get that whole Zen thing from bonsai. I actually find it a bit of a struggle. And that's a struggle. Where I find beauty and motivation in the practice is through the accumulation of nostalgia and material, right? So going out to the landscape, being in the landscape, like I'll go down to Tasmania and go on a couple of day hike and explore off track with Jared Bailey. Most of the time we'll just find a route, find a mountaintop we want to get to, and we'll find a path and we'll get up to that mountaintop and see trees that no one has probably ever seen before, and just soak that in, have experience, have memory, have nostalgia, have community. And then through that inspires me to come back and grind it out and create work that, again, from what I said originally when we started this podcast, not necessarily the best, greatest trees in the world. Like, I don't really care about having, quote unquote, what is the best tree. I want to have trees that connect me back to the landscape, and then allow others to hopefully be able to connect through that tree to those landscapes.
Right.
So that's become a huge piece for me, is making sure I continue to be out in the world amongst people at the same time, preferably. Yeah.
Yes. One more follow up with that idea, just that bringing it back around. I think you're doing that is, do you think the greatest tree concept, as you've stated, could lose a lot of people as far as the natural getting back to the basics of, you said you want to create a tree that brings people back to nature. Do you think creating this perfect tree of this embodiment can throw off some people? Because like, I've never seen that before. Why does that look so perfect? The tree outside my house looks completely different. It's got a dead branch. You know what I mean? Is there a component in that as well?
Sorry, your question framing around like a tree that.
Oh, so
you mean
so
sorry,
the perfect tree, does it really exist, right? Outside in the natural environment, is there an entity that creates this push for you to be? I want to create a tree that's natural in nature, right? not naturally perfect in nature.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's just I want to create work that just literally has some sort of resonance of that place and space. And that could be, it could be that work is a study, where I think of a lot of my trees as studies. Like, oh, in this tree, I have decided to focus on this branch structure because I noted that in a general vicinity of a forest out in this mountain somewhere. I saw this branch structure, so in this tree, I'm going to exercise that. And through that, I gain then further understanding of that environment and landscape and how those trees are reacting to that, blah, blah, blah. So I don't think there's no perfect form tree example. There's the pursuit of pursuit of that perfect form for sure. But there is definitely something, and I know this when I do go out hiking, and I always bring my camera because that's part of the documentation. It's part of my process, as I said before. But there's a thing. Some trees you choose to connect and photograph because there is an intrinsic beauty, and there's others, although are beautiful, you don't have that same touch base with. There's a thing there, and I think that is the act of curation, and that is you just curating your what is visually beautiful to you. And generally, I think humans have a general understanding of beauty as a species, because we're all one animal. I think we connect to trees that have that kind of sense of harmony within the environment, the sense of like they could be nurturing almost, might be a way of thinking about it. So that, there's trees you photograph and there's ones you don't. And the ones you do obviously become the ones that empower you to create work about.
Definitely.
So I think inherently there is a perfection in a sense. There is, in a frame, there's a sense of perfection for sure. But I don't think there's no one form that is that.
I like that. That's another, tonight has been an amazing conversation. I think Ryan agrees the same. It's been a wonderful pocket of inspiration for me, honestly, as I'm going to Japan in 2 days, and then seeing that, I'm hopefully going to be going to see some bonsai there. And now having this approach with your cultural understanding and things too, I appreciate it. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's been a really great conversation. I really enjoyed this. This is great.
Awesome.
You guys great to talk to.
Thank you for educating all of us on Australia and your wildlife there.
100%.
Yeah, that's it. Lots more to share, but hopefully that gave you guys a good starting point.
Little taste. Yeah, we would hope. We'd love to have you on again sometime if you'd be down.
Yeah, absolutely. This is
catch
fun.
back up, and like I said, our community's big enough that we can have a lot more voices just in our little circles that are, growing.
I agree. I think there's a lot more room for things like podcasts and media and surrounding bonsai. There's definitely So hats off to you guys for doing this. It's great.
Thank you. Any last words to the fans? Anything where can they find you?
That's
Instagram,
important.
website.
Can't forget that.
So you can find me at you can find most of like Facebook, Instagram, website, Tree Makers, in all its different ways. I think Instagram is just Tree Makers. I think Facebook is Tree Makers Bonsai. Website treemakers.com.au. You can follow my personal work on Instagram too. I've got another account. I think it's just called Hugh Grant. And that's how you can find me. So easy.
And people can message you there and everything too.
They can message me there. Yeah. All contact details are there.
Awesome.
Very cool, Hugh.
Thank you, Hugh.
Keep up the good work in Australia.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day at work, and happy holidays.
Well, happy holidays.
Happy New Year.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Later, bud. Peace.
See ya.
Today's episode has been recorded, produced, and edited by Kevin Ferris and Ryan Houston. Our music was provided by MIDI Cancer. To find more music from MIDI Cancer, check out their SoundCloud and Bandcamp pages. To find more information on the podcast, please check out our Instagram page, Bonsai Time Podcast, and our website, bonsaitimepodcast.com. To stay in touch with us, Kevin's Instagram is Kevin_Ferris, PNW, and Ryan's website is rai2tree2.com. You can find these links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and bonsai on!